Hello and welcome back. It's me, Valerie Monroe, and my trusty book buddy, Bookwormy. Hello and welcome back to another week of reading together. That's right, we've been reading Down the Swale. So glad you're here. We are glad they're here because it's such a tasty book. As I was saying, we've been reading Down the Swale, and we had just ended where Brogden was in the boat and some kind of creature had just come into the boat. The name of the boat was Almost Home, and the creature had sneezed and had fallen down on the bottom of the boat, looking like it was dead. Let's see what kind of creature it was. Remember, I told you to think about what kind of creature it might be. When he was able to see the body that was attached to the small white face, Brogden felt quite silly and relieved. It was an opossum, and it appeared to be a very young one at that. He'd learned all about opossums from Aunt Gladys. Oh, those ridiculous blokes, she'd said. Overly dramatic, if you ask me. They lie there like they are dead as a doornail, causing everyone to go into mourning like they are really dead. Why, I've heard of entire funerals being held and beautiful eulogies given on account of such shenanigans, and then, just before the burial, she'd pause, shaking her head in disgust, the opossum comes alive again, causing everyone to go into a state of shock and hysteria, as well you can imagine. And she sneered, those prehensile tails, ugh! Brogden had listened to all this with great interest, but felt her comment about the tails was really not fair. It wasn't as if creatures could control if they were born with a prehensile tail or not. He actually thought prehensile tails were quite interesting. Now, I want to show you a picture of what an opossum looks like. You might not have ever seen one because they're only out at nighttime. But thinking again about an opossum's ridiculous habit of playing dead, Brogden gave the animal absolutely no attention. Instead, he turned away and began humming a tune that Aunt Hazel had been singing lately called, Oh, the Spring in Splendid Glory. He was well into the last line of verse 3, and the honeysuckle sweet, when he glanced sideways and caught the opossum opening one eye and stealing looks at him when he thought Brogden wasn't looking. It was just as Aunt Gladys had said. The opossum was, well, playing possum. So Brogden began a new tune, this one with a peppier beat than the first. It was called the Syncopated March of the Millipedes, which Aunt Gladys had deemed absurd, stating you couldn't possibly march to a syncopated beat. But Brogden liked it and found he could march to it if he kept a steady beat by snapping his fingers. It was a snazzy tune. I like that one better, the opossum suddenly called out and rolled into a seated position. It's so nice and jumpy. Do keep going. Upon being complimented, Brogden launched throatily into the remainder of the verses, and the apostle's prehensile tail swayed back and forth as he kept time. He ended by crooning a series of arpeggios, do 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 do, and gave an encore performance of the chorus, and a half step higher at that. Bravo! Bravo! The opossum clapped his paws together enthusiastically and stood for an ovation. Brogden bowed deeply and sat down cross-legged next to the opossum. The furry creature extended a front paw for a shake. 14, he said. I have only 10, Brogden smiled and held up both of his hands, displaying his fingers. No, no, the opossum explained. That's my name, 14. That's a number, Brogden said. True, the opossum agreed. I'm one of 14 brothers and sisters, which is not all unusual for opossums. We are marsupials, you know. When we're born, we aren't any larger than bees, and we do much of our growing in our mama's pouch. Well, after about 2.5 months, it gets awfully squishy in there, what with everyone's elbows and knees bumping into each other's backs and tummies. Well, there simply wasn't enough room for us in the pouch, so Mama invited all the relatives over for exiting day. It's the traditional big day for opossums when we all climb out of the pouch and onto our Mama's back. Let me show you a picture of what that might look like. Up until that point, our whole extended family showed up for the event. Up until that point, nobody had even seen us or knew exactly how many of us there were. He paused for a second to remember more of the details, twitching his little nose from side to side. When my first sibling exited Mama's pouch, he went on, everyone cheered. Hooray! It was a boy, and naturally he was named after my father. My second sibling was a girl, and when she exited, everyone clapped. He went on. She was named after your mother, Brogden guessed. Of course, 14 said. Our exiting continued with whistling and hooting and stomping and the throwing of confetti, as we were each named after a relative. And then we lined up on Mama's back, he said. Who were you named after? Brogden asked. Great Uncle Oliver, he replied. Being as I was squished near the bottom of the pouch, I exited second to last, and all the really good names like Rocky and Vinny were taken, he sighed wistfully. As it turned out, really didn't even matter. That was the first and last time my mother ever called me Great Uncle Oliver. With 15 of us to take care of, it was impossible for her to remember who was who, he said. Brogden nodded. I can imagine. Sam, she'd say, pointing to Joe, and Sam would say, no, Mama, that's Joe. I'm over here. She mixed up Frankie with Herman and Carly with Shelley and never could remember Janie, who'd been named after a very distant cousin. It became worse and worse, downright confusing. Things became so bad that at one point we were all forgetting our own names, having been called by the wrong ones so many times. We were spending most of our days arguing over who was who, and finally Papa suggested we just keep the family names for the first girl and boy and give everyone else a number. So Papa hung us up by our tails on a branch and gave us a number, and that's how I became 14. Wow, said Brogden, who was an only child and couldn't imagine having so many brothers and sisters. 15 wasn't called 15, though. She was called Baby. 14 hung his head. Sometimes I do wish I had a real name. What name would you choose? Brogden asked. 14 sat thinking and twiddling his thumbs. I didn't like my first real name, Great Uncle Oliver, but wouldn't mind being called Ollie, he said, brightening. Ollie it is, then, Brogden declared, and I'm Brogden. By the way, you haven't said why you are here. Ollie went on to say that although his family was on the whole a jolly and loving bunch, the burrow they lived in was very cramped. There was hardly anywhere to sleep, and he was always one of the last to get any food. So I've decided to strike it out on my own, he said. This beach has become ideal because the house dwellers who come here are quite messy. They leave all kinds of snacks behind when they head home for the day. Chips, pretzels, crackers, and if I'm really lucky, chocolate. He said this dreamily and patted his stomach, and Brogden thought he saw a line of drool drip from the corner of Ollie's mouth. Yes, sirree, Ollie went on, it's been a paradise, and now that it's spring, some of the boaters leave scraps behind too. That's why I was trying to get into the boat, he confessed. I'm so sorry if I scared you. Why are you here? He asked. Brogden told Ollie everything, from his unplanned tumble down the swale to the drain pipe. He held up his bandaged ankle dramatically. To the frisbee, remember that? To his encounter with Fred and Nancy, the ducks, to stowing away on the boat. I'll be heading home first thing tomorrow, he said. Well, that's good to hear, said Ollie, because, well, I usually don't buy into local gossip, but I've been hearing some strange whisperings about this lake. What do you mean? Asked Brogden. Well, for one thing, this. He scooted over the top of the seat to the opening of the boat cover and stuck his head out. His large ears swiveled around, and then he motioned to Brogden and said, Come here, quick. Brogden climbed up next to him, poked his head out of the opening, and listened. The night sounds of the lake were a cacophony of bird calls, cricket chirps, and cicada songs. What is it? Brogden asked. He couldn't pick out anything specific. Listen harder, Ollie said. Brogden did the best he could, and beneath all the other sounds, he could hear croaking, which seemed to be coming from the tall reeds on the far side of the beach. The croaks had been there all the time, but with all the other sounds, they just blended in. The longer he listened, the more the croaking began to drown out the other sounds. He realized the croaks were words. Danger! Danger! The croaks were saying. Danger! Danger! A wave of fear washed over Brogden, beginning with the hairs on the back of his neck, traveling all the way down to the tips of his toes. His hands felt slick and clammy, and a queasy sort of feeling took hold of his stomach. Oh, I'd give anything to be home with my aunts in our hut under the wooden staircase and next to the swale right now, he thought. He moved closer to Ollie, who sensed Brogden's apprehension and wrapped his tail protectively around his shoulders. It gave Brogden a small sense of comfort. What does it mean, Ollie? Whispered Brogden. What is the danger? Fred and Nancy didn't tell me about any danger. But you did say that Fred and Nancy were new to the area, Ollie whispered back, so they probably didn't know. All the locals have been talking about there being some kind of danger for weeks now. Ollie, said Brogden, will you stay here in the boat with me just till the morning? The opossum twitched his little whiskers back and forth as he considered the request. The frogs were still croaking their warning. Well, I don't see why not. It's just one night, but the truth of the matter is that I'm nocturnal. That means I'm awake most of the night and I sleep during the day. Are you nocturnal too? No, Brogden admitted. Actually, I was asleep when you got here. Well, seeing as how being nocturnal is part of who I am, I won't be able to go to sleep, explained Ollie. Well, perhaps you could. Brogden began trying to think of a solution. Anything to convince Ollie to stay. He did not want to be alone with an unknown danger lurking about. Count sheep, Ollie guessed. Been there, done that. Last time I tried that, I was well into the thousands as the sun was coming up. Oh, said Brogden, well, that's okay. I can fall asleep quick as a wink. I won't even hear you if you're scurrying about. I just feel better knowing that someone is here. What with those frogs going on about danger? Okay, I'll stay. If you're sure I won't be a bother, Ollie agreed. I certainly wouldn't want anything to happen to you. Ollie pulled the cover taut until no light came in at all. Laying back on the life jacket bed with the blanket up over his head, Brogden was unable to hear the croaks. He held onto his shoe as he drifted off to sleep. And to his credit, Ollie did try to sleep. He lay on the floor near the seat where Brogden was sleeping, and for a while, all was still. But after a short time, feeling restless, an urge to get up and move about overcame him, and he began to scurry around the almost home. He paced up and down from the bow to the stern and ran laps on the bow seats. He wrapped his tail around the steering wheel, hung upside down, and swung back and forth. He fiddled with the radio dial. He explored every nook and cranny with his twitching nose and whiskers. But in the end, it was hunger pangs that made him leave. He could no longer wait to rummage near the trash bins on the beach. And just before dawn, he popped open the cover and scuttled out of the boat. I hope you enjoyed that part of the story today. That was a great part of the story. Please come back tomorrow to read with us. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye.